So welcome back to part 2 of our image review for Unit 5, Revolutions. Remember that in part 1 we covered governance, technology and innovations, and humans in the environment. So obviously with part 2 we'll cover cultural developments and interactions, economic systems, and social interactions and organization. So, without further ado, let's get to it. Now, remember cultural developments and interactions. We have ideas, beliefs, religions, how society view themselves, how they interact with each other, and the implications of it. Now, the big thing here is the concept of the Enlightenment. Remember that for Unit 5, the Enlightenment is an entire learning topic that includes two separate thematic focal points. It has two separate learning objectives and a total of 5 historical developments. So the first thing right off the bat, we see an image of our friend John Locke. And the reason why we have John Locke is because one of the historical developments specifically says philosophers developed new political ideas about the individual, natural rights, and the social contract. Locke is on here because of his notion of the social contract, wherein individuals within a society, if we use people and government, individuals enter into this social contract with their government. The government, sets the rules that citizens living in a society must follow. The flip side of that is that individuals within that society agree to abide by those rules as long as the government respects their individual rights, values their freedoms. So there's that give and take that's involved with this. And then, of course, with the Enlightenment, there's a wonderful picture of an Enlightenment salon. And we have, the rise and diffusion of Enlightenment thought that questioned established traditions in all areas of life, often preceded revolutions and rebellions against existing governments. And these philosophies, these individuals would often meet and gather in these salons in France, Paris, one of the more prominent examples. They applied new ways of understanding and empiricist approaches to both the natural world and human relationships, re-examined the role that religion played in public life, and emphasized the importance of reason. These learned men would meet and they would discuss. They would talk. They would debate. They would have a back and forth give and take about new types of ideas. And keep in mind that even though women were excluded from participation in these salons, they often would host them. So as we'll see in a little bit, this is where we're going to start to get new ideas about gender roles and gender norms, all coming about as a part of this Enlightenment movement. Now, economic systems. We have societies being affected by the way they produce, exchange, consume goods and services. On the left side of the screen, we have the man of the hour, Adam Smith himself. And Adam Smith is specifically in the historical development where Western European countries begin abandoning mercantilism. So that notion of colonies existing to benefit the mother country, there's a finite fixed amount of wealth that just changes hands. Western Europe is abandoning that and adopting free trade policies, partly in response to the growing acceptance of Adam Smith's theories of laissez-faire capitalism and free markets. Remember that laissez-faire is a French term, and it simply means, depending on your individual translation, let it be, leave it alone, hands off. Simply put, governments did not take too active of a role in private business, private industry, and the economics of their country. If you take Smith's basic argument, market forces would determine the course of business. Simple supply and demand. And again, that's a very simplified way of looking at it. And then on the right hand side, you see stock markets. The global nature of trade and production contributed to the proliferation of large-scale transnational businesses that relied on new practices in banking and finance. And one example of these financial instruments are stock markets. Now, what we see here is the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, and it was founded in 1602 by the Dutch East India Company. And the purpose was to deal in printed stocks and bonds. Now, this Dutch East India Company received a monopoly on Dutch trade in Asia, and it's really one of the first large multinational corporations to get an exclusive deal such as this. And this stock market, this exchange, was designed to provide stock assurance to spread risk and dividends across a wide pool of investors. And here's where we're also going to see the rise of the LLC, limited liability corporation, where you have all these pools of investors putting their money in the pot. Business goes belly up, you lose what you put into it. You don't lose all of your possessions. Your risk is limited. That's where limited liability comes from. So again, with the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, that's just one example of these new financial instruments. And then we arrive at social interactions and organization, the old theme of SIO, societies grouping their members, norms that govern their interactions. When we look at SIO, there's a couple of different ideas we have going on here. Now, off the bat, if we go back to 5.1, all right, we're looking at the Enlightenment. We have Enlightenment ideas and religious ideals influenced various reform movements. They contribute to the expansion of rights. And one of the examples in a historical development of expansion of rights is the end of serfdom. The image that we see here is Russian serfs are gathered so that the Emancipation Edict, the Emancipation Edict of 1861 is being read to them. Remember that a little under a decade prior to this, the Russians were involved in the Crimean War, where a vast number of serfs were forced to fight for the Russian Tsar, and it went terribly for Russia, and the serfs really bore the brunt of it. And by this point, with the spread of Enlightenment ideals, there had been enough pressure that had been mounting to free the serfs. Now remember, it's not as glamorous as it sounds. Often the serfs were given absolutely crummy land that was tough to sustain a way of life. They had to pay for their freedom, but nevertheless, it is the result of the spread of Enlightenment ideas. And we also have demands for women's suffrage and an emergent feminism challenge political and gender hierarchies. Here's a little image from the Seneca Falls Conference organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. So we are going to upstate New York, the exact same year that Wisconsin became a state, 1848. And we have new ideas about the role of women in society. So definitely the United States continues to play a key role in some of the developments from this time frame. So with the Enlightenment, we not only see cultural developments, but we see different ideas of how society should conceive of its members and how they should interact with one another. Now, moving to 5.8, we look at reactions to the industrial economy. And with this particular learning topic, there are 4 separate historical developments. So on the far left, we see Karl Marx himself. Discontent with established power structures encouraged the development of various ideologies, including those espoused by Karl Marx and the ideas of socialism and communism. Marx had a number of writings, Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. where he believed that you had the bourgeoisie, essentially the owners, the proletariat, the workers. Now, again, this is all very simplified form, but he believed the proletariat would rise up, take control, overthrow the bourgeoisie and take control of the means of production. They own the factories. All right, so that's where a lot of the roots of communism were laid. When we look at labor unions, in industrialized states, workers would organize themselves, often in a labor union. They would use this to improve working conditions, limit hours, gain higher wages. So, this notion of like a 16-hour workday, they would fight against that. Where you show up to work, you don't know if you're going to leave alive or with all of your limbs. They would fight for safe working conditions. As the time frame moves on, because remember, we're looking 1750 to 1900. One of their big slogans: 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for whatever we will. So labor unions will try and achieve those goals. And finally, we have Chinese Empress Qi Shi, who was a concubine and rose to the role of empress in the later portion of the 1800s. So in China, with the Qing dynasty, some governments sought to reform and modernize their economies and militaries, but these efforts were often resisted by members of the government or established elite groups. There were funds in China that were earmarked for items such as railroad construction and modernizing the military, but she would divert those funds for her own personal means. So that's just one example of how the elite would often resist efforts to change, all in reaction to industrialization. And finally, when we look at society and the industrial age, we do see here actually two developments. We have this new middle class, and this is one reason why Marx's ideas didn't necessarily take root. He didn't foresee a rising emergent middle class as a buffer between the elite class and the lower proletariat, so to speak, the working class. Often these individuals were characterized by the fact that they didn't have to use their backs and their hands for labor. So they're enjoying a new type of lifestyle. And we also see different, actually dual roles here for women. Women in working class families held wage earning jobs to supplement their family's income. This family has a maid, working class woman, whereas middle class women that you see here didn't have the same economic demands. So their goal was to create a haven for their husband to escape the drudgery of industrial life, take care of the home, take care of children. So women's roles are affected by industrial change. And we, of course, see the new working class. And this also shows us the problems that came with rapid urbanization, like pollution. You pollute the water, it leads to public health crises like cholera. And we also see increased crime, housing shortages, all these people jammed into tenements. One of the negative, or one of several negative side effects of rapid, unplanned urbanization. Now, the key target reasoning process is continuity and change. The learning objective for this topic, and you can think of it for the whole unit, explain the extent to which industrialization brought change from 1750 to 1900. So take a few moments, look at the prompt, figure out how you might address this. What's your argument? How would you contextualize it? And what pieces of evidence would you use to validate your claim?